It all started with a raise, approved, celebrated, and then mysteriously erased the moment it reached legal. That single disappearance pulled the protagonist into a hidden war inside the company's upper floors, where buried contracts, secret memos, and deliberate retaliation formed a maze of corruption no one was meant to uncover. Each step deeper revealed another lie, another vanished document, another executive terrified of the truth resurfacing. But when the protagonist accidentally triggered an $80 million royalty clause long thought dead, everything exploded. Auditors stormed in, leadership collapsed, and a corporate empire built on deception finally cracked. All because one employee refused to stay silent. A surprising development unfolded inside the company when HR confidently assured a mid-level analyst that their long-delayed raise had finally been approved. The internal review was complete, the signatures were in place, and the document was forwarded to the legal department for final confirmation. For a brief moment, everything seemed settled. But within a single day, the paperwork unexpectedly disappeared from legal's tracking system. Legal representatives claimed the file never arrived, directly contradicting HR's statement that the document had been formally submitted. The conflicting reports immediately stirred quiet tension between the two departments. Inside HR, confusion turned into unease. Several team members insisted they had followed protocol, while others whispered that legal often lost sensitive documents when internal politics were at play. The analyst, caught in the middle, began sensing that this was more than an administrative hiccup. Meanwhile, employees around the office reported seeing an unusual level of closed-door meetings. Department heads moved with forced calm, exchanging looks that suggested something bigger was brewing behind the scenes. No one spoke openly, but everyone felt the pressure shift. The analyst, still without answers, tried to remain patient. Yet the silence from both HR and legal only deepened their suspicion. Something was being buried, intentionally or not, and they had no idea why their raise had suddenly become a point of friction. By the end of the day, it was clear that the missing document was not a simple oversight. What should have been a routine approval had triggered ripples across multiple departments, hinting at a hidden conflict the analyst had unintentionally stepped into. The sabotage had begun, even if they didn't yet understand its scale. The disappearance of the approved raise continued to send ripples through the company, but the situation took a darker turn when a quiet dispute broke out near the legal department. Several employees reported overhearing raised voices behind a half-closed door, something about misfiled documents and avoidable exposure. The analyst, still in the dark, walked past just in time to catch the tension in the air. Later that morning, a senior HR coordinator was seen confronting a legal associate near the elevators. Although both attempted to maintain composure, their hushed argument carried across the hall. Observers claimed the legal associate repeatedly insisted that certain files should never have been pushed forward, while HR demanded accountability for the missing raise request. As this standoff unfolded, word of other disappearing approvals began to surface. A manager from finance quietly admitted that 2 bonuses had hit delays after being sent to legal for routine verification. Though unrelated on paper, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Something was wrong, and it was becoming harder for the company to hide it. The analyst, now increasingly uneasy, noticed how people lowered their voices whenever they entered a room. Conversations that used to feel casual now died abruptly when legal staff passed by. The atmosphere transformed from workplace routine into a silent battlefield where alliances were shifting and no one knew who to trust. By midday, a rumor spread that legal had recently been dealing with a complex contractual issue involving external partners. Some employees described seeing boxes of old documents carried into a restricted conference room. Others claimed legal was on edge due to an internal audit. No one could confirm the truth, but the mysterious tension fed speculation across departments. As the analyst moved between meetings, they caught snippets of conversations that made their skin crawl. Phrases like royalty calculations, breach exposure, and escalation penalties seemed completely disconnected from their missing raise, yet somehow felt relevant. It was as if the raise had fallen into the orbit of a much larger corporate crisis. Toward the afternoon, the analyst noticed that certain managers were suddenly more guarded around them. One supervisor abruptly stopped in mid-sentence when the analyst entered the room, replacing candor with forced politeness. Another quietly advised them to stay focused on your tasks, in a tone that felt more like a warning than encouragement. Meanwhile, HR began acting nervously. Instead of offering clarity, They pushed for patience and urged the analyst not to escalate anything prematurely. A phrase that landed with the weight of hidden fear. It was clear that HR no longer controlled the situation. They were reacting to forces behind the scenes. As the day wound down, the analyst overheard a chilling remark from a legal assistant who didn't realize they were within earshot. If that clause gets triggered, it won't matter whose raise gets approved or denied. Everything will blow up. The assistant was quickly shushed by a colleague, but the damage was done. The analyst walked away with a racing heart. Tension across the company intensified the following morning when the analyst was unexpectedly asked to assist with an old file archive review. An unusual request that immediately raised suspicion. HR framed it as routine cleanup, but the analyst sensed it was more about containing the fallout from the ongoing disputes with legal. Still troubled by the missing raise, they reluctantly agreed. Inside the dusty storage room, rows of neglected boxes held years of forgotten contracts, amendments, and financial reports. As the analyst sifted through brittle folders, the silence around them only deepened their unease. This didn't feel like cleanup. It felt like someone wanted inconvenient information buried under the guise of busy work. Hours passed before the first hint of something unusual appeared. A stack of yellowed agreements marked with red tabs labeled disputed. Many were ancient deals with legacy partners the company barely mentioned anymore. One folder, however, seemed strangely heavier, as if stuffed with more pages than the others. Curiosity pushed the analyst to open it. Inside was a contract dated over a decade ago, binding the company to a long-term commercial partnership that no one in the current office ever discussed. The analyst flipped through its clauses, noting unusual phrasing and several crossed-out sections replaced by handwritten addendums. Every line seemed to raise more questions than answers. Then they found it, buried near the back of the contract under a faded label reading royalty adjustment mechanism. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine financial clause. But after reading it twice, then a third time, the analyst felt their throat tighten. The clause stated that if certain revenue thresholds were reached, thresholds the company had exceeded last quarter, the royalty payout would automatically escalate by an amount exceeding $80 million. The realization sent a shock up the analyst's spine. This was no minor discrepancy. This was a legally binding trigger that could devastate the company's quarterly earnings and drown its profits for the year. And from the looks of it, no one currently in charge had acknowledged it publicly, or even privately. Just as the analyst processed the implications, they heard approaching footsteps. Startled, they quickly closed the folder as a legal supervisor entered the storage room. The supervisor's expression froze when they saw what was in the analyst's hands. Their tone was icy but controlled. "Those documents aren't part of your assignment. Please return them to the shelf." The analyst complied, but the supervisor's eyes lingered on the contract a moment too long, confirming precisely what the analyst suspected. Legal already knew about the clause. And they had been desperately trying to hide it. Suddenly, the mysterious behavior of the past week made perfect sense. Back at their desk, the analyst couldn't shake the weight of what they discovered. Every whisper, every closed-door meeting, every piece of missing paperwork now pointed to one conclusion. The company was sitting on a catastrophic financial time bomb, concealed by legal to protect the executive suite. And the analyst had unknowingly stepped right into the center of it. By the day's end, the analyst understood exactly why their raise had vanished when it reached legal. The moment their name appeared in any documentation routed through that department, they became a liability. A witness with access to the wrong paperwork at the wrong time. And now, after uncovering the clause, they were more dangerous than ever to the people trying to bury the truth. By the next morning, the atmosphere inside the company had shifted from quiet tension to barely concealed panic. Overnight, senior executives convened an emergency meeting on the top floor. The blinds were drawn, security hovered outside the room, and not a single manager made eye contact with staff as they walked in. Though no formal announcement followed, everyone sensed something enormous had erupted behind closed doors. Rumors spread quickly after a legal assistant was overheard saying, "They found it. Someone actually found it." She was immediately hushed by a colleague, but the damage was done. The analyst, who recognized the phrase instantly, felt a sharp chill. There was no doubt the assistant was referring to the buried royalty clause discovered the day before. Soon HR began issuing instructions that only intensified suspicion. All employees were told to halt any document requests involving historical contracts. Internal systems, usually accessible, suddenly displayed restricted warnings. Several folders the analyst had opened just yesterday now required executive-level clearance. It was a digital lockdown, and the timing was impossible to ignore. In the cafeteria, clusters of employees gathered in whispered circles, trading theories about a financial breach or an accounting oversight. Some claimed that the emergency meeting involved board members dialing in from overseas. Others insisted that legal was scrambling to reconstruct a timeline proving they had never been aware of the clause, a claim that would absolve them of responsibility. The truth was far more complicated. The analyst, meanwhile, found themselves carefully watched. Two legal associates passed by their desk several times, pretending to check a nearby printer. A supervisor from HR stopped to ask, "Are you feeling okay? Rough week?" A question that seemed less like concern and more like an attempt to gauge whether the analyst intended to talk. Every friendly face now carried a sense of calculation. By midday, word leaked that the company's largest partner, connected to the very contract containing the clause, had scheduled an emergency call with the finance division. The partner apparently wanted confirmation on last quarter's revenue numbers, a detail that only mattered if the clause had been triggered. The analyst realized with a sinking feeling that the window to hide the truth was rapidly closing. Inside legal, chaos was visible even from the hallway. Staff rushed papers between offices, executives barked orders with rising frustration, and one paralegal was seen in tears after being reprimanded loudly for mismanaging the archive logs. The same supervisor who confronted the analyst yesterday now looked exhausted, as if holding together a collapsing dam with bare hands. HR didn't fare much better. Their leadership team spent the afternoon drafting vague statements, in case an internal communication becomes necessary, though none were sent. The department's attempt to project calm only highlighted their fear. It became clear that HR had not been informed of the clause's existence and were now scrambling to understand how deeply they were entangled in the fallout, especially given the analyst's missing raise. Throughout the day, more employees began connecting the dots. Why had multiple raises, bonuses, and approvals vanished in legal? Why had old contracts suddenly become sensitive? Why were executives so visibly shaken? The narrative forming among staff was dangerous. Legal had suppressed a clause worth tens of millions, and the consequences were now spiraling beyond containment. By evening, silence fell across the office like a storm front. Every department was bracing for impact, waiting for someone, anyone, to announce what was really happening. But no announcement came. The only certainty was that the situation had escalated far beyond internal politics. The analyst, unknowingly holding the key to the entire crisis, realized the company was racing against time, and that their accidental discovery might have triggered the biggest corporate meltdown in years. By the next morning, the company's internal landscape had transformed into a battlefield. HR, legal, finance, and operations were no longer cooperating. They were maneuvering. Every department tried to shield itself from the fallout of the $80 million clause, and every conversation carried the sharp edge of fear. What had begun as a missing raise had now become a full-scale corporate crisis. The analyst arrived at work to find their inbox flooded with meeting invitations, many from people who normally never contacted them. One invite came from HR, another from a legal supervisor, and a third from a senior executive assistant. Each request was marked priority, and each meeting was scheduled at conflicting times. The message was clear. Multiple departments wanted access to the analyst, and none wanted to be last. In the first meeting, HR attempted to portray calm professionalism. Despite that, their questions were suspiciously pointed. What documents did you access in the archive? Who instructed you to enter that room? Did anyone from legal speak to you afterward? The analyst realized these were not routine inquiries. HR was trying to determine how much liability they shared if the truth came out. Minutes later, the analyst was ushered into a legal conference room, where the tone shifted from polite concern to veiled intimidation. A legal supervisor insisted that the archive assignment had been miscommunicated, and that the analyst's access had been accidental. But their tight posture and clipped words betrayed the truth. They were terrified of what the analyst knew, and even more terrified of what they might say. As the day progressed, alliances shifted visibly. HR staff held closed-door discussions with finance. Legal scrambled to produce documentation showing they had no prior knowledge of the hidden clause. Senior executives attempted to rally department heads but were repeatedly interrupted by urgent messages from the company's external partners. Each group was fighting to protect its own interests, not the organization. The analyst felt their presence magnified. People who once ignored them now watched their movements carefully. Conversations hushed whenever they approached. Some managers treated them with forced kindness, offering coffee or asking about their workload, an attempt to curry favor, or perhaps to calm a potential whistleblower. Others eyed them with thinly disguised hostility. In the afternoon, the analyst received a summons from an executive whose reputation for ruthlessness was well known. The meeting room they entered felt more like an interrogation chamber than an office. The executive leaned forward and asked directly, "What exactly did you see in those files?" The analyst hesitated, and the executive's expression sharpened. "Be careful how you answer," they warned. "This situation is delicate." What the analyst didn't know was that internal emails had already leaked. Messages between legal and senior leadership acknowledging the existence of the royalty clause and debating whether to suppress it. The thread spread quietly among mid-level managers, and by the time the analyst left the meeting, half the company already knew that executives had been hiding a potential financial catastrophe. As fear escalated, blame began circulating aggressively. HR accused legal of negligence. Legal accused HR of mishandling documents. The corporate tension reached a breaking point the following morning when an internal memo began circulating through the upper floors. The memo, marked "strictly confidential," alleged procedural misconduct surrounding the rediscovered royalty clause. Though it didn't name names, employees quickly pieced together the subtext. Someone was being positioned as the scapegoat. And the analyst's recent involvement made them the most likely target. The first sign of betrayal came from an unexpected source. The analyst's longtime mentor, a senior manager known for being level-headed and supportive. He called the analyst into his office under the guise of offering advice. But the moment the door closed, his tone hardened. He asked pointed questions about the archive search, the conversations with HR, and the interactions with legal, all while avoiding eye contact. Something was off. By the end of the meeting, the mentor delivered a blunt warning. "You need to be extremely careful. People upstairs believe you accessed documents beyond your authorization." The analyst stared in disbelief. He knew the truth. The mentor had signed off on the archive assignment, and legal had been the ones to intervene afterward. But the message was clear. The mentor was distancing himself to protect his own position. The betrayal deepened when new restrictions appeared on the analyst's account. Access to shared folders was abruptly revoked. Email privileges were partially suspended. Even their ID badge triggered extra security checks at the entrances. These moves were quiet but deliberate, meant to isolate the analyst, making them appear as someone under investigation. Meanwhile, legal doubled down on its defensive strategy. A supervisor informed HR that the analyst had entered a restricted section of the archive without clearance, a claim HR had no choice but to record. The statement contradicted earlier records, but legal's insistence, and their proximity to the scandal, gave them the upper hand. HR, unwilling to shoulder the blame, accepted the narrative with little pushback. In the break room, whispers followed the analyst everywhere. Some colleagues offered sympathetic glances, while others avoided them entirely. A few quietly suggested that the analyst had triggered something they shouldn't have, as if the crisis were the analyst's reckless doing rather than the company's long-standing negligence. The narrative was shifting, and not in the analyst's favor. The real blow struck in the afternoon. The mentor, the very person who once championed the analyst's work, submitted a formal statement implying the analyst had acted independently, bypassing protocol, and potentially exposing the company to significant legal risk. It was a devastating betrayal. The analyst realized their mentor had not just distanced himself, he had actively contributed to the blame campaign. As tensions escalated, the analyst was summoned to a meeting with HR leadership. Instead of seeking clarity, they asked the analyst to explain inconsistencies in the documentation trail. Every answer the analyst provided was met with cool skepticism, as though the conclusion had already been decided. It was no longer an inquiry. It was a quiet prosecution. By late evening, the company's narrative had taken shape. A low-level employee had accessed a sensitive contract without proper clearance, discovered a financially disastrous clause, and inadvertently endangered the company. The truth, that legal had hidden the clause for years, was being buried beneath layers of polished statements and strategic silence. The analyst left the building feeling more alone than ever. The corporate machine had made its move, sacrificing one of its own to shield its upper ranks. But unknown to the executives tightening their grip, the analyst wasn't defeated. They were angry. And that anger would lead to the moment that would flip the entire crisis on its head. The morning after the betrayal, the analyst arrived at work with a quiet, calculated determination. While the company's leadership believed they had cornered their scapegoat, they overlooked one critical detail. The analyst still possessed something far more dangerous than access: knowledge. And once knowledge becomes leverage, the balance of power shifts. The first turning point came when a mid-level finance manager, known for her blunt honesty, discreetly approached the analyst. She revealed that she had seen the emergency financial model that legal was trying to bury. Not only did the $80 million clause exist, she said, but finance had flagged it years ago before being ordered to ignore outdated assets. Her whispered words confirmed what the analyst already knew. The cover-up was far older and deeper than anyone admitted. Armed with this, the analyst made a bold decision. Instead of defending themselves in silent meetings and one-sided interrogations, they compiled their own timeline: emails, assignment logs, meeting requests, and even the original archive work order that proved their access had been authorized. It was a meticulous record that exposed every lie used against them. The true breakthrough came when a supportive IT administrator quietly restored the analyst's restricted access for a single hour. During that window, the analyst downloaded audit logs showing that the restricted folder had been accessed multiple times over the last decade by executives who publicly claimed ignorance. The logs were irrefutable. And with them, the analyst held a truth capable of toppling careers. As word of potential evidence began to circulate, legal scrambled to regain control. They launched an internal review that was clearly meant to intimidate anyone who might support the analyst. They questioned junior employees, demanded access to personal notes, and warned staff not to discuss unverified claims. But the harder legal pushed, the more fractures appeared in their story. Meanwhile, HR found itself cornered. Their attempt to paint the analyst as a rogue employee was collapsing under the weight of new information. Several HR staff privately admitted they had been pressured to reframe the analyst's assignment after the clause was discovered. Some were terrified. Others were silently ready for the truth to come out. When the analyst presented their compiled timeline to a small group of mid-level managers, the reaction was electric. Managers exchanged stunned glances as they realized the scale of misconduct. The betrayal, the hidden clause, the falsified records. None of it could be explained away as a misunderstanding. This was systemic deception reaching into the highest layers of leadership. The tipping point arrived when one brave manager forwarded the analyst's timeline to an outside compliance officer connected to the company's board. Within hours, the board quietly launched an emergency investigation. This time, not led by legal. Rumors spread quickly that multiple executives were being asked for clarifying statements, and that the board had demanded all records related to the decade-old contract. By late afternoon, panic erupted among senior leadership. Executives rushed between offices, legal frantically tried to seize control of the narrative, and HR found themselves stuck between conflicting demands. Meetings that were once calm became explosive. Shouted arguments echoed through the halls as blame ricocheted between departments. By evening, the analyst had done the unthinkable. They had forced the company into checkmate. The fallout erupted before sunrise. As employees logged into their inboxes, they were greeted with an unexpected message from the board. A formal announcement of an independent compliance audit, targeting senior leadership, legal, and any department involved in historic contract management. Panic swept through the office as whispers turned into open astonishment. This was no longer an internal dispute. This was a corporate reckoning. Before the morning was over, 3 senior executives were placed on immediate leave pending investigation. Their offices, once symbols of untouchable authority, now stood dark and sealed behind security tape. Legal supervisors who had spent the past week controlling the narrative suddenly found themselves stripped of system access as external auditors took over. The mood flipped instantly. Those who wielded power were now facing the consequences of their long-hidden decisions. The analyst arrived to find a cluster of managers waiting near their desk, this time not to intimidate, but to offer quiet apologies. Some were embarrassed, others visibly shaken. Several acknowledged that the analyst's timeline had become the backbone of the board's inquiry. One manager, voice trembling slightly, whispered, "You saved the company from collapsing under a lie." It was the first genuine recognition the analyst had received in weeks. Meanwhile, the finance division released preliminary findings confirming the worst. The $80 million royalty clause had indeed been triggered last quarter. For years it had been buried, ignored, or deliberately concealed by those in power. Now, with auditors uncovering deleted emails and altered records, the truth was undeniable. The financial hit was enormous, but the integrity hit to the company was even greater. HR, once complicit in the quiet persecution of the analyst, shifted its stance dramatically. The department issued a brief internal note admitting procedural irregularities regarding employee assignments and documentation handling. Though carefully worded, the confession was a clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The analyst's missing raise, once dismissed as a clerical error, was now recognized as evidence of systemic manipulation. As the corporate storm intensified, the board summoned the analyst for an official interview. Not as a suspect, but as a key witness. The room was formal but not hostile. The board members listened intently as the analyst described each step leading to the discovery. The archive assignment, the confrontation in the storage room, the shifting narratives from HR and legal, and the eventual attempt to frame them. When the analyst finished, the lead board member nodded solemnly. "You showed integrity when others didn't," she said. While the investigation continued, the company took rapid action to stabilize its future. External legal counsel began renegotiating the royalty obligations with the partner company, shifting the risk from catastrophic to merely severe. Compliance teams drafted new guidelines to prevent contract concealment. Executives who once dominated meetings now avoided the office entirely, aware that their actions were being dissected line by line. By afternoon, the internal atmosphere felt transformed. Employees who once avoided the analyst now treated them with newfound respect. Conversations carried a tone of relief, as if the company had survived a disaster only because someone dared to uncover the truth. The analyst felt the weight of the past week's lift, replaced by something unexpected: vindication. But the final twist arrived in the evening, when the board issued a company-wide memo restoring all privileges to the analyst, correcting their records, and confirming, at last, the approval of their long-delayed raise. The memo went further, stating that the analyst would be reassigned to a new cross-departmental compliance role, a position designed to prevent future concealment and built directly from the chaos they helped expose. As the analyst left the building under a sunset sky, the company's facade of stability finally cracked open to reveal a new beginning. They had walked through sabotage, betrayal, and corporate warfare, and emerged not only undefeated, but essential. What began with a missing raise had ended with the collapse of a conspiracy worth $80 million. And in the end, the truth had reshaped everything. The company entered a state of controlled panic the moment the external auditors stepped onto the 38th floor. Their arrival was unannounced, unrequested, and unmistakably triggered by the protagonist's discovery in the previous chapter. Overnight, quiet whispers in the hallways evolved into frantic closed-door meetings as leadership scrambled to understand how the $80 million royalty clause had resurfaced, after years of being intentionally buried. Within minutes, legal attempted to regain control, issuing emergency instructions to pause all document transfers and limit internal communication to need-to-know only. But the auditors were already ahead of them. They possessed a complete digital chain of custody log showing every hands-on interaction with the forgotten contract, including the moment the protagonist accessed it. The timeline left no room for reinterpretation. Someone in legal had deliberately tried to bury the clause. By midday, HR found itself unexpectedly pulled into the chaos. The protagonist's missing raise, once brushed off as bureaucratic misplacement, was now being treated as a potential retaliatory act linked to the resurfacing contract. HR leaders, pale and tense, were forced to reopen the case in front of the auditors, revealing inconsistencies so blatant they could no longer be explained away with administrative delays. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed the mounting tension from a distance, refusing to step forward unless absolutely necessary. In Chapter 8, they had narrowly avoided a confrontation with the director of legal. Now, every department head seemed more afraid of appearing in the same room as them. The protagonist didn't plan to weaponize their knowledge, yet simply having the truth made them radioactive. As the auditors expanded their scope, they uncovered a series of emails between legal and a senior executive instructing staff to ensure no compensation changes are processed for individuals working near Contract 47B. That clause alone sent shockwaves across the company's highest ranks, confirming what the protagonist had suspected but never dared articulate. There was a coordinated suppression effort. Late in the afternoon, an emergency town hall was announced. Employees gathered in the main atrium, confusion rippling through the crowd. The CEO appeared on stage, unusually stiff, reading from a script that barely concealed his unease. He confirmed that an internal compliance review was underway and warned staff that any interference with contractual records or employee compensation will be handled as a federal matter. The moment the CEO stepped down, several executives were quietly escorted to interview rooms. Phones buzzed across the office. The rumor mill exploded. Some whispered that the board was ready to force resignations. Others speculated that the royalty clause, now worth tens of millions, had been suppressed because activating it would expose years of financial misreporting. Amid the unfolding chaos, the protagonist received a message on their work laptop. Report to conference room C. Immediately. No sender name. No context. The air inside conference room C felt heavier than the rest of the building, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The auditors waited in complete silence, their expressions unreadable. The protagonist sat opposite them, aware that anything said here could reshape the entire company's future, or obliterate it. The lead auditor began by replaying the screen recording of the moment the protagonist accessed Contract 47B. The grainy footage showed the forgotten royalty clause lighting up on the monitor like a warning flare. This wasn't an accident, the auditor said, his voice cutting through the room. You searched for something very specific. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to tell the truth. The protagonists steadied their breath. For weeks, they had been pulled through a maze of missing documents, hostile managers, and cryptic corporate interference. Now every piece of the puzzle was converging. They explained how HR had promised their raise was approved, only for legal to somehow lose the paperwork the moment they asked questions about the missing contract. The auditors exchanged glances. Nothing about this case resembled a standard clerical error. Then compliance entered the conversation. The VP of compliance, visibly shaken, slid a stack of internal memos across the table. These memos revealed a covert instruction dating back over a year. Any employee discovered digging near legacy partner agreements, including Contract 47B, was to be flagged, their compensation frozen, and their access monitored. The protagonist felt a chill. Their experience hadn't been an isolated incident. It was a pattern. As the protagonist read the memos, a darker truth surfaced. Someone high in legal had intentionally locked away the royalty clause, knowing its activation would trigger a financial obligation exceeding $80 million. If the clause remained hidden long enough, the partner organization would lose its right to claim the money. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't confusion. It was corporate sabotage dressed as procedural oversight. The auditors pressed further, revealing that the unexplained disappearance of documents didn't stop at the protagonist's raise. 5 other employees across different departments had experienced similar misplacements after stumbling across connected financial records. Most had quietly transferred out or resigned. The protagonist wasn't the first target. They were just the one who refused to drop the thread. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A fire alarm blared through the building, but no one moved. The VP of compliance checked their phone and turned pale. They're trying to evacuate the floor, she whispered. Someone doesn't want this meeting to continue. A forced evacuation would break the chain of questioning, scatter key witnesses, and delay everything long enough for evidence to accidentally disappear again. The lead auditor acted immediately. He locked the conference room door from the inside, signaling the interview would proceed regardless. We're not leaving, he declared. Not until we finish. Outside, muffled footsteps filled the hallway. Executives scrambling, phones ringing, security shouting instructions. Inside, the room felt like the epicenter of a corporate earthquake. Finally, the protagonist spoke again, this time with complete clarity. They told the auditors about the conversation overheard in Chapter 9. The director of legal ordering staff to bury the clause until the contract expired. The auditors leaned forward, recognizing the gravity of the testimony. If verified, it would constitute deliberate financial deception on a scale that could topple the entire leadership team. As the meeting stretched into its final minutes, the fire alarm abruptly stopped. The office fell eerily quiet. The auditors closed their folders. Thank you, the lead auditor said. This changes everything. The protagonist exhaled, unsure whether they had just saved the company, or lit the fuse on its destruction. The tension in the building became almost physical after the protagonist exited conference room C. Security escorted them toward the elevators, but not aggressively. More like they were protecting a high-value witness. Employees along the hallway paused what they were doing, whispers traveling faster than footsteps. Everyone knew something enormous was happening, even if they didn't yet know the scale. Before the protagonist could ask where they were being taken, The elevator doors opened to reveal a completely different atmosphere. The 42nd floor, usually quiet and reserved for high-level meetings, was a battlefield of frantic executives, anxious assistants, and board members arriving in dark suits. It was clear the auditor's findings from Chapter 10 had detonated at the highest level. The protagonist was guided into a private waiting room. Through the frosted glass, muffled arguments could be heard. Voices rose, accusations flew, and names were shouted: the director of legal, the CFO, even the head of HR. Someone slammed a table. Another demanded access logs. It was chaos wrapped in corporate politeness, the kind that meant careers were about to end violently. Then the CEO's voice thundered through the hallway, unmistakable even behind closed doors. "You told me the clause was buried years ago. How did this resurface? Who else knew?" His anger wasn't directed at the protagonist. It was aimed inward, at the very people who had sworn allegiance to him. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a mutiny disguised as operational failure. While the protagonist waited, an unexpected visitor entered the room. The VP of Compliance from Chapter 10. She looked exhausted but determined. "The board wants your full testimony," she said quietly. "They're preparing to remove half the leadership team, but they need one more piece to seal it." Her expression suggested she knew exactly how dangerous that request was. Moments later, she handed over a thick packet of redacted documents. "These were hidden in an encrypted archive," she explained. "They show a coordinated effort not only to suppress the $80 million royalty clause but also to interfere with internal compensation systems." The protagonist flipped through the documents, recognizing their own name highlighted in one of the memos. Proof of retaliation. The boardroom doors finally opened, and silence fell across the floor. A senior board member stepped out, scanning the hallway before locking eyes with the protagonist. "You," he said firmly, "come with us." Every executive standing nearby diverted their gaze, suddenly fascinated by the carpet. None dared to acknowledge the person whose discovery had toppled their carefully maintained deception. Inside the boardroom, the protagonist was met with 15 faces. Some furious, some frightened, some calculating. The lead auditor stood at the end of the table, alongside compliance officers who had spent the entire day tracing digital fingerprints. The board chair spoke first. "We understand you did not intend to expose this," she said. "But your actions may have saved this company from criminal liability." The questions came rapidly. When did you first notice the missing contract? Who denied the raise? Who told you to stop asking questions? Every answer pulled another thread loose. Executives shifted in their seats as the protagonist recounted conversations, emails, and the carefully orchestrated obstructions they faced. What started as a simple HR issue had become a blueprint of corruption. By the end of the questioning, the board members exchanged grim looks. When the dust finally settled, the protagonist, once dismissed over a missing raise, stood at the center of a corporate reckoning that exposed buried contracts, retaliatory schemes, and an $80 million deception that nearly toppled the company from within. What began as a vanishing HR document spiraled into a brutal war between truth and power, dragging auditors, the board, and terrified executives into a conflict they could no longer control. Through persistence, instinct, and sheer refusal to be silenced, the protagonist turned a forgotten clause into a catalyst for justice, forcing a corrupt leadership empire to collapse under the weight of its own secrets. And in the end, the company learned the costliest lesson of all. Sometimes the smallest injustice is the spark that brings an entire kingdom to its knees.